All right. Gaza War Day 380. Lebanon War Day 34. And no end in sight. I haven't said that in a while, have I? Yeah, definitely no end in sight. And what do we have? Well, the West Bank fighting in Tulkarm. The usual Israeli operations to go into the West Bank towns and try to kill people. Their last stand battles. Some uh, resistance fighters killed by the Israelis. They're fighting back in various places in the West Bank. So that is the West Bank front. The um, Iraq front, Iraq is launching drones towards Golan. Jordan apparently shot one down. Great to see that Jordan is with Israel to the very, very end. And there was reports you may have seen a couple of infiltrators from Jordan conducted an attack on Israel a couple days ago. Uh, I didn't follow through with too much detail on that one. I saw it, I did notice it though come across. Some of you may know more and want to say so in the comments. Iraq is active. Okay. Now, Iran, people wanted me to address the supposed leak. So there's supposedly a leak of some American leaked knowledge of the Israeli plan to attack Iran. I'll tell you why I'm skeptical about this. Because Iran, Israel and America are not separate entities, okay? Like Indica said, um, Israel has already been defeated militarily by the Axis of Resistance. The Axis of Resistance now faces America. This is an American war. We have seen reports of U.S. Special Forces hands-on conducting the genocide in Gaza, which is what I thought we would start to see more of. I'm sure there are U.S. forces in Lebanon. Uh, Greg Stoker told me he thinks obviously they're in Iraq. They've been bombing Yemen. They've been bombing Iraq on behalf of the Israelis during this war. They are doing things with Al Qaeda in Syria. This is in no way some kind of Israeli operation that is separate from the US, where the US is obtaining intelligence on what the Israelis are doing. The Israelis are doing everything they're doing with American weapons, with American intel, with American data sets, with American equipment, with American personnel. This is America's genocide. This is America's seven front war. This is it. The idea that America received sensitive data about what Israel was planning and leaked it. It's all totally bizarre. There's someone who I follow on Twitter. I think their handle they have surprisingly serious tweets for their handle, which is I believe Bidet, Bidet Marks, Marxman, Bidet Marksman. They've got a big following, well deserved. And they said this is probably just some last minute election maneuvering to win over people who are thinking of going Zionist voters who are thinking of going Republican because they don't think the Democrats will go up against Iran the way the Republicans will, and the Democrats want to convince that Republican voter to vote for them instead because the Democrats and Republicans are competing over the same number of voters, and they're both trying to convince that Republican voter that they're more Republican than each other. And honestly, you know, nothing, nothing, nothing good will come out of this election, no matter who wins. And it does not behoove us, especially those of us outside who know that this issue will be settled on the battlefield, to pay overly to geek out on this election the way they would like you to. But point being, I don't really think you should make much of this leak, this supposed leak. Um, in terms of reality, I believe the US and Israel are, I continue to believe the US and Israel are going to attack Iran soon. I believe Iran is going to hit them back. I don't know how hard these hits will be. Each of the hits by Iran on Israel have been surprising, technically very competent, and not damaging enough to give Israel the message. It seems to me that there is a little bit of shadow boxing still happening on the Axis side. I don't know about shadow boxing. I would rather say they are not going all out the way that Israel is going all out in terms of committing atrocities. The resistance is not going all out. Not that the resistance would commit atrocities like Israel. That's hardly fathomable. Israel and the Western sponsors are outdoing themselves every day, as you probably know, in Jabalia in the north. Today in Lebanon, the Israelis are targeting a bank, a whole banking system, and people in the West are celebrating the destruction of these bank buildings as if this is a shutting down terrorist financing. I mean, I've said this many times before, but this doctrine of expressed most particularly in a particularly German and vile way by Baerbock or whatever the hell her name is from Germany, who said you lose your civilian status. And if you follow the historical podcast I've been doing, which you can't because archive.org is down, but we've been talking about World War One, and before that, we've done the Scramble for Africa and German, um, this kind of vile German discourse and behavior. The Germany has never, since it existed as a country, which is like 1870 or so, has never distinguished between civilians and military targets. They've always been very open about it. They've always had these disgusting um, people go forward and defend it, whether it was the Kaiser or some of the military officers under the Kaiser that conducted the genocides in Africa, or the World War II officers. The World War II Nazis of that time, as opposed to the Nazis of this time. World War One officers, all of these people, it's a continuous line. People think that the Nazis were some kind of discontinuity for Germany. They absolutely were not. I've learned recently that even in terms of plans to enslave Eastern Europe and plunder Eastern Europe and make it into a colony for Germans, all of that predated the Nazis. That was all stuff that German military high command in World War One was fascinated by those ideas, and they were openly expressing them. So this Baerbock, whoever, all of these Germans that are out here defending Israel's genocide are in the proud and century plus German tradition. There is nothing to be surprised by there. But with Israel targeting this bank and this doctrine of if they're embedded, right? Matt Miller, Count Smirkula, as people are calling him, he said Israel has the right to target civilians. As he said that explicitly in a press conference now, and I mean, people in the West, if they have the right to target civilians, if Israel has the right to target civilians, does Matt Miller have the right to rule over us? Do these people who believe in the right of Israel to commit genocide have the right to rule over all of us? Have the right to take everything from the societies that they're pillaging and give it to Israel to murder more people and say that they have a right to target civilians? Is this a tolerable situation? in terms of the consent of the governed. I don't know. I don't know. Um, but they're targeting a bank. They're targeting a bank of, I don't know, I think 300,000 plus people have their deposits in this bank, and Israel is attacking the banks. And it's like, when I first heard that they were attacking a bank, I just thought, like, are they ever gonna attack a military objective again? Is there any, or are they just like, it's hospitals, schools, um, mosques, and now it's banks. Um, I don't know what they're gonna do next. Insurance, real estate, dentists. I mean, they already destroyed dentists, bakeries, houses, but I don't know. Are they gonna go through like different industries? Are they gonna go and attack shawarma places, Hezbollah affiliated shawarma places? I don't. The specialization that Israel has in attacking, in sending the most powerful weaponry available to a Western army and then using it on specifically civilian targets is it's really something to behold. It's really something to behold, and our colleagues and the people all around us in the Western elite, and their social media followers just defending all of this is something to behold. Something to behold. So that's they're also bombing Dahieh, they're bombing Beirut, and yeah, and really deepening the genocidal campaign against northern Gaza. And I don't know. I mean, between Baerbock and Matt Miller's performances this week, I there's not gonna be nobody should be surprised if they're just out there saying, yeah, we love killing children. I don't know. I don't know. There's nothing vile. There's nothing too vile for them to say anymore. There's nothing too vile for them to do or admit to. And I get the sense they don't any longer feel like lying to you anymore. They don't feel like they have to. They feel like the whole system is totally insulated from ordinary people, the majority of whom don't want genocide, and they don't care, and they're going to do it anyway. Um, so yeah, someone else on Twitter said something about that. They said, the propaganda pivot that's coming is more like, yeah, we're doing genocide, but everybody does genocide and it's not such a big deal. And that could be right. You can see that even with you can see that with anti-genocide people, like keep it subtweety. I bet everybody knows who I'm talking about. But there were somebody who just like talked about a bunch of Western crimes like Sudan, Congo, Palestine, and then just threw the Uyghurs in there, the Chinese Uyghurs, as if he knew what he was talking about. And it's like, if you just toss the China Uyghur thing in there and not like a dozen other situations like Balochistan or Saudi Arabia's campaigns against Shia, or um, India oppressing Kashmiris. There's so many situations you could have just tossed in there if you're like, I'm one of these world oppression guys, and like I'm just against every oppression. Or maybe this person that I'm talking about was a Muslim, and he said, I'm against the oppression of Muslims, which is why he threw in the Uyghurs, but not Kashmiris. So it's just like somebody who can't tell real from fake genocides, and that's also a way of laundering the genocide against Palestinians, right? If you say everything is genocide, like what China is doing to Uyghurs is genocide, and what Israel's doing to Palestinians is genocide, like that does render the term meaningless, right? You can no longer really understand, and that's also why I object to people saying this is not new, or this is the same thing that happens all over the place, or it's always been like this. It's like all of these things that you're saying are diminishing the crime against Palestinians, and I think that is what Israel would love for you to do. Um, Palestinians and Lebanese now. You're basically saying that Zionism is just like what everybody does or what everybody would do if they had the chance, or the same kind of thing as happens all over the world. And that's not true. And doesn't um it detracts from the urgency of trying to stop this genocide. And it absolves Israel from its role, and Zionists in the West and our Western elites from their role in conducting this genocide against the people of Palestine and now Lebanon and whoever else is next, Syria, Iran. So don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. I mean, if you're studying a situation, and I've said this many times, I know a lot about Russia, Ukraine. I know a lot about China. I don't talk about it. I don't think now's the time. And I'm not the guy. I've said this before. I don't have the authority to talk about these things. I've never been to Russia or Ukraine, or China. I don't. I've never been to the front lines of these wars. I have for Palestine. I have. I know a lot. Um, yeah, I'm. This situation is the situation um, that I came here to talk to you about, and that I've been talking to you about this year. And if you look back at my record, I've been talking about it for 22 years prior to this, a little bit more, but give or take. And if I was gonna come and compare this to some other situation, I wouldn't just throw the names of the ethnicities in there. Like, uh, I when I if it deserves its own study, then you should study it, and you should do the kind of in-depth work that you clearly believe it deserves. Um, what I did, like you can actually go back on this channel and see that I have done some study of China and the Uyghurs and compared it to India and Kashmir. I had Carl Za, who's also studied it really extensively on, and we talked about it. We did a series years ago before this genocide started. But I'm a little bit more focused on that right now. And people who are focused on that, you can't just throw in something, you can't just throw the Uyghurs in and be like, I'm, Palestine and the Uyghurs. Like, it's like I said, if you're gonna study it, do your study, do your work, present your work. We can look at it. We can look at your sources. Adrian Zenz being the pretty much the only one for this, or the East Turkestan network, or whatever they're called. Your two sources, and we can critique them, and we can figure that out. And then the gigantic mountain of evidence of genocide and intent, and the videos, and the people fleeing, and the actual destruction that you're watching unfold. And it's like you can't tell the difference between these two situations. That's not good. It's not good that you can't tell. And so, um, yeah, anyway, what I'm suggesting here, and even with Sudan, I have written a little bit about Sudan, but not the current war. I have started researching the current war to I was thinking of writing an article about it, but when I write about it, it's going to be on its own terms. It's not going to be to throw in Sudan in a discussion of Palestine. And I know, like people know maybe that I've written a large book about the Democratic Republic of Congo and the wars there, Rwanda's role and the US role specifically. And again, it's not something I just throw in. I don't just throw the Congo in when I'm discussing Palestine. The Congo is the DRC deserves its own study, it deserves its own work. And you can make comparisons, knowledgeable comparisons. You certainly there are connections between Israel and Rwanda, especially there are connections. U.S. foreign policy is all over these things. The agenda of imperial plunder and dominance, dominating post-colonial states and denying them sovereignty and pillaging their resources. All of this is at play in all of these situations, for sure. But one does not simply throw in a different situation into your Twitter tweet about Palestine. Um I don't think you should do that. That went on a little bit longer than probably it needed to. Let's get back to the report. Um I talked to you about what Israel is doing in Gaza and Lebanon, but you hopefully know that the both resistance in both of those situations has had some spectacular actions that they've taken. In Gaza, the in the midst of the genocide in northern Gaza, um, in Jabalia, the Qassam brigades, the uh, Hamas's armed wing, they used an explosive device, one of their Shawad devices, I believe, to destroy one of the armored vehicles that was invading and committing genocide in North Gaza. And the vehicle they blew up turned out to contain a colonel, one of the colonels of the 401st, I think, Armored Division, and uh, killed him. So he was killed. One of the colonels was killed in action. An Israeli colonel was killed in action, I believe, yesterday in North Gaza. And in Lebanon, Hezbollah, maybe it was Hezbollah. I don't know if anybody's fully acknowledged it, but a drone hit Netanyahu's house, the prime minister of Israel's house. He was not home, maybe. It was just one drone, but that's another sign of intelligence and targeting ability and the ability to surpass all the defenses. And presumably, after this immense bombing of Beirut and Dahia and the attacks on the bank, there will be some answer, including surprises, as Hezbollah likes to say, that they have surprises and more is coming and they're in a different phase. So the point just being there that the ability to hit, let's just say the ability to target senior leaders on the Israeli side also exists. And I think the past couple of days with between Hezbollah and Hamas, Qassam brigades, has shown that between killing this colonel and hitting Netanyahu's house with a drone strike. So let me see. There's one other thing I wanted to address today, and it's a broader issue, something that I've been thinking about for months. And it is the question of morale and the possibility of a collapse of Israel's army, which everybody I've asked has told me is not going to happen. But I keep going back to the possibility that it might happen. And I had this I had this belief because bef in May, before the Rafah operation happened, the Israelis were hesitating, and I wondered why they were hesitating. And Rafah has this certain width that the other areas they had attacked didn't have, and there was a potential for getting into conflict with the Egyptians. The Egyptians proved to be completely, what's the word? Non-conflictual with the Israelis as they have always been since the 70s. And so that didn't turn out to be a problem, but there were various problems. But the thing that I wondered about specifically was whether Israel would get was worried about the cohesiveness of their army, whether the army would follow orders, whether the army would fall apart. And the reason I wondered whether they would fall apart was because I Israel doesn't fight long wars. Their doctrine, their training, and everything is they remember short, sharp wars on other people's territory. And I knew that they were trying to transform themselves. Israel today can take casualties, right? That's what they want you to understand. Today's Israel takes casualties. Today's Israel kills hostages. They don't care about their hostages. They have Hannibal doctrine for hostages. They have Dahiya doctrine for everything. They commit genocide. They're terrifying. They take casualties. They kill. They die. It's fine. They're don't mess with them. That's the message of the new Israel. The question is, what is that like? What is it like to be in that army when when you have this risk of getting blown up by an improvised explosive device or a grenade or a shoulder launched missile at any time, and where in Lebanon now you're facing really meaningful rocket and mortar fire, complex ambushes, and even in Gaza, senior officers, sniper operations. And Lebanon, it's just started, but they're having trouble mustering. Their special forces, their scouts are getting taken out by Hezbollah's special forces. So, what is it like to be this army? This army that's supposed to be huge numbers of men, conscripts for days, 70,000 men on the Lebanon border, just tens of thousands of troops just rotating through, 1,000 armored vehicles, unlimited firepower, unlimited air power. But like, you're just going back to the same places, you're committing the same crimes, you're taking the same pictures in the same destroyed houses, you're putting on the same underwear over and over again, you're playing with the same kids' toys. What is it like? Does that lead to collapse when your officer tells you when you're wearing women's underwear and you're dancing to techno and you're taking pictures for your dating profile and your officer tells you, okay, now we're going to go and attack some people that might shoot us back, or I want you to all to get in the armored personnel carrier and we're going to drive on a road that might have one of these explosive devices. um, what is it like? does do you follow that order? Does that Do you have military discipline despite the appearance that you are a kind of genocidal rabble? And yes, I think the answer is that they do have military discipline of a kind, despite the appearance of being a genocidal rabble. But I also think that the war going on seemingly forever, the economy constantly declining, the um, repetitive nature of the genocide, the monotony of the genocide, and the random chance of dying or suffering fatal injury is wearing them down. And so that takes me to this article. Sina Tusi, who's a foreign policy, kind of a mainstream foreign policy writer, I gather, um, goes through this article from an Israeli paper. Um, Morale, loss, and exhaustion, a suppressed but growing phenomenon. The Nahal Brigade began its 11th round of combat in Gaza in September. Out of 30 soldiers, only 6 showed up. The rest claimed medical exemptions. Medical exemptions. The mother of one of the soldiers describes the futility they feel. They keep going back to the same buildings they've already cleared to find them booby trapped again in the Zaytun neighborhood alone. They've been there 3 times. They understand it's pointless. There's a growing shortage of manpower. One soldier says the platoons are empty. Those who aren't dead or physically wounded are mentally broken. Very few come back to fight, and even they aren't fully okay. This was before Lebanon. I don't know with what army they think they'll enter Lebanon, the soldier says, because there is no army. I'm not going back to battalion. The article states that there's a suppressed but growing phenomenon of soldiers refusing to fight. They reached a sense when they could not continue. When they had to return to places they'd already been, it broke them. What's killing them are the conditions and prolonged fighting without any end in sight, not to mention the loss and horrific scenes they witness in Gaza. Presumably that means scenes of them getting hurt and killed. We're sitting ducks in a shooting range. We don't understand what we're doing here. The hostages aren't coming back, and it just feels never ending. Soldiers are getting injured and dying along the way. It all seems pointless. Some of these soldiers refusing to serve are not being sent to jail. The situation is being kept quiet. Soldiers describe themselves as depressed, exhausted, and drained of motivation. The article describes this situation. They feel abandoned by the army. We're all exhausted and couldn't see the purpose in going back to places they've already been. Mentally exhausted, anxiety. I broke down crying on a lawn, saying I couldn't take it anymore. I was completely finished mentally. And they leave and they go look for mental health help to continue their genocide, um, and emotional blackmail from their families, cultural differences. One commander told his subordinates, I come from a Polish family where we don't talk about feelings. Okay, Polish people don't talk about feelings, apparently. Um, a similar situation is unfolding with soldiers entering Lebanon. They're threatened with fines for military equipment lost or destroyed on October 7th or during the fighting, and are denied new equipment until they sign that they're responsible for the loss. No idea what that means. Like if you're using a tank, you have to sign an indemnity for the tank. That doesn't make any sense. Maybe it's your like rifle, your personal kit. I don't know. If the treatment doesn't improve soon, little wind in our sails left will also disappear. So all very interesting. And, what keeps a huge army in the field, it's not a small feat. It's a big deal. And if you don't have a lot of practice doing it, you can face collapse from logistical reasons, never mind psychological reasons. And then the idea that you don't have anything that you're fighting for, you have no path to victory. You're just a roving death squad, a gigantic roving death squad. I always thought that that would eventually lead to collapse. The question is, how long will that take? And I've also believed that, an invasion of Israel by Lebanon, by Hezbollah, for example, that could give morale of the Israeli army a new lease on life. But I assume that if there is any kind of plan for that, the Israeli army would have to have collapsed first. So are we on our way to collapse? I mean, there's not too many examples, but there are a few examples of armies, big armies being assembled and collapsing. Again, World War One, the Russian army under the Tsars, they had they invaded East Prussia at the beginning of the war, and they were a huge army. They faced a big German army, but they kind of just ran out of they got huge losses at the hands of the Germans for sure at the Battle of Tannenberg, but they also ran out of logistics, shell shortages, and demoralization. Demoralization was a huge deal when there was all this revolution happening, and the before the Bolsheviks took over, there was like what are we fighting for? You know, the Tsar abdicates. You were always fighting for the Tsar, you know, like the emperor, the country, the fatherland. And then the Tsar abdicates, and it's like, what does that mean? So who are we? What are we fighting for? What is this all for? And the fact that they had lost the 1905 war with Japan, there was just all this combined to cause the collapse of the Russian army. And and so that's a major example in history of an army kind of disintegrating. I think there are some big differences between the Russian army in 1917 and the Israeli army today because they're not facing anything like the millions, hundreds of thousands of casualties that the Russian army had against the Germans and inflicted. I mean, World War One was on a scale that is almost unimaginable, except compared to World War Two, which was on an even bigger scale. But you can look at a case of an army collapsing because they lost the sense of what they were fighting for and they didn't have a sense of a path to victory while they're taking losses and having other logistical and other issues. So it's something that has been on my mind for months now. And then the other example, of course, is the Americans in Vietnam, where the disobedience towards officers. There's a documentary called Sir No Sir. I would highly recommend that. It's a very interesting documentary, but well documented lots of instances of junior officers fragging, like using a fragmentation grenade to kill their to kill their officers. So rank and file soldiers killing their officers, refusing to fight. Then there's other kinds of collapse. It's not just mutiny or insubordination. It's also drugs, which the Israeli army is well known for, and Israeli society is well known for using lots of drugs, addictions, and general kind of psychological collapse. And the thing is, Israel has always been a social experiment, and the Israeli military is a social experiment, and the Israeli society and military after October 7th is a gigantic social experiment. And I don't believe you can commit genocide without going crazy. So it seems like that's a feature in terms of Israel's understanding of it and not a bug, to use computer slang. But they're not able to admit that. They're not able to talk about that. They're not able to really say what they're doing, but they know that they're doing that no matter how much they strive to dehumanize their victims, they know that they're doing things to their fellow human beings that should not be done. And the fact that they're doing them, the very fact of doing these things is making, I would imagine, a large percentage of them clinically insane. I don't know what the consequences of that are, but I do have a feeling, an intuition that an army, a work culture for tasks to get done in a social context, you have to have a sense that when I have a task, I will complete that task. When I have an order in a military context, I will fulfill that order. When I have something to think through as part of my job, as a professional job, I will think it through and solve problems in the context of the education that I have. If you are committing genocide, murdering children, blowing up buildings with people in them, starving people, destroying aid, day after day, I wonder when someone tells you to do something, whether you are going to do it, whether you feel like doing it or not. And Israel also has this culture. It's a racial democracy, but they have some kind of democracy for Jewish Israelis. And I have seen reports of soldiers saying we don't want to follow orders that might get risk our lives. And so there's this democratic culture that when people are tired, when a majority of people are tired and cowardly and um, demoralized for reasons they don't understand, having to do with the atrocities they're committing, their democracy might see them voting not to do certain things. So the US withdrawal from Vietnam was partly one of the causes was that the army was disintegrating. The military institution was disintegrating and degrading, and they didn't want to just let that happen, and they decided to withdraw rather than letting that process and that rot continue. And it's impossible to argue that the Israeli military is not rotten. But the question is, how is it rotten? Is it rotten in a sense that it can continue to function and commit genocide, but also fight all the resistance organizations that are increasingly arrayed against it? Or is it rotten in the sense of a rotten organism that's going to collapse from within? We will see. Um, Time will tell. But the history of Israel and the whole idea of short, sharp wars on other people's territory was because Israel always understood and expected the US, the United Nations, even to call them off. All of their previous wars were called off by the Americans, going all the way back to 1956, maybe even 48. But 1967, they were they were racing against time because they knew that a ceasefire resolution was going to come, and they were going to have to follow it because the Soviet Union was one of the Security Council members, and there would be actual consequences to not following the ceasefire resolution. And likewise, 73, likewise, 1982, there was a resolution that forced them to stop at a certain point, also because of Syria and Syria's army playing a big role. But 2006, the United States gave them time and time, and then eventually told them to stop. And 2014, they were called off. 2018, they were called off. All of these wars that Israel has fought have been called off by the Americans. Ultimately, because of constraints the Americans faced. This thing that Biden and Harris have done by not calling Israel off They put Israel into a situation that Israel has never been in and doesn't know how to handle because all of Israel's creative thinking and military thinking has gone into accomplish as much as we can before we're called off. And so never the America will never call them off. And so now they're just they're just facing this open-ended conflict where they've made continuing the conflict the goal of the conflict. They've got the financial tap and the weapons tap completely open, and they're going to go until they're stopped or until their military collapses. And that is what we're facing now. That is where we are. As far as the short term, there will be a response from Lebanon for the bombing from Hezbollah for the bombings of today. And Israel's attack on Iran will come, and then there will be a response from Iran. And those new conditions will be the conditions that we are condemned to watch um, and able to do so little about um, in the next phase of this war and genocide that we're watching. Um, Maybe there will be more opportunities to do more things to try to stop it. If there are, let's share them and do them. Until then, hang in there. I will see you in the next one.